so let's continue on with weak statements. Like I said, they are very connected in the way that they imply that the issue is the issue and the concern and responsibility of both the speaker, or is the concern and responsibility of both the speaker and and receiver of a message. Example, we need to figure out a budget that doesn't bankrupt us. So it's a connective thing. We both need to do this or we're both going to be bankrupt. So there's a positive and a negative to we language. The positive, it can help build constructive climates together. So it can help build these constructive, we're in this together sort of attitude. But the negative side is it can come off kind of as presumptuous or demanding. Like, we need to do this. It's like, well, no, that's kind of your responsibility, not mine. And you're the only one going to have any issues if it doesn't happen. So I don't need to do anything, actually. So that's where it can get presumptuous and demanding. And you're like, whoa, don't add me into this situation. All right, so we then go into using behavior language. But I'm actually going to skip that because that would be better if we had a class and we could do partners. So let's skip on that and actually go into gender and language and how that affects language. So, content. Both women and males, men and women, we both talk about work, movies, TV, personal appearance, sex, dating. That's pretty common for all of us, men and women. On the female side, though, the content, a lot of times, and again, when I say these things, it's typical, or not typical, but more likely. So it's not all women and all men talk about this, it's more typical. So more typically, females tend to talk about personal and domestic subjects, relationship problems, family, health, reproductive matters, etc., etc. While men, on the other hand, tend to talk about music, current events, sports, business, and other men, just as a typical tend to do this. Again, not saying that if you're a woman, you're always talking about these things, or if you're a man, you're always talking about these things. It's just a tendency when men are talking to men and females are talking to females. And then reasons for communication. That doesn't really differ between the two. Men and women are both trying to communicate, are both communicating to build and maintain relationships. How they do this, however, how they communicate to build and maintain these relationships is what differs. So women tend to involve feelings, relationships, and personal problems more into their communication styles. And while men usually emphasize making conversations fun, so that a lot of times they add in a lot of jokes and good-mannered teasing into their conversation, probably to get it maybe a less emotional or intimate when talking. And then your conversation style. Women use more intensive verbs, emotional references, uncertainty verbs, and relationship maintenance questions. They ask more of those. And men are more likely to use sentence fragments, judgmental adjectives, directives, and I references when speaking. If you want to get further into that, you probably should have already done that. This is just an overview. More detail is when you should be reading your textbooks. Alright, so non-gender variables. So these are the variables when it comes to conversations that are not affected by a person's gender. So first, social philosophy. So kind of socially, who are you? What kind of personality traits do you have? Are you cooperative or are you more competitive? Are you a feminist? Are you not a feminist? That can affect the language and the communication styles you use. Speaker orientation. So that kind of goes off the competitor and cooperative. I don't know why that made it. Those go hand in hand, those two. And then your occupation, the way you talk, kind of can be affected by your occupation a lot of times. So you might talk more technical wise if you're in a job that is more technical. And so I saw this little something moving in the back window, and I'm like, there's only branches behind me, or is there? I need to stop watching horror movies at night. So I turned around, and yeah, it's just the bush behind me blowing in the breeze. Anyway, so yeah, your occupation, and then, for instance, a teacher often uses more grammatically correct sentences, especially an English teacher. I know you can't hear it from me sometimes because sometimes my words come out as mush, especially on these videos, but a lot of times I like to think that my sentences are grammatically correct as much as I can make them. And then your gender role. So we didn't read this chapter because we skipped over it, but in I think chapter 4 the textbook said, it broke down gender roles and how just because your identity is female, like your sexual identity is female, that doesn't mean that you take on the typical gender role. You might be more masculine female, or feminine male, or androgynous, which is kind of like a mixture in between, or not really conforming to any gender role, masculine or feminine. And that can affect it, the way you speak and the way you converse with people, the gender roles. Okay. And then culture and language. So culture and language can affect the way you communicate in 3 different aspects. So the direct and indirect, which go into low context cultures and high context cultures, which we'll go more over in a second. The elaborate and succinct, I always hate that word, I'm never really sure how to pronounce it. And then the formal and informal. So first, let's go into direct and indirect. So if you're more of a direct speaker, you're more likely to be from a low context culture. So low context cultures generally value using languages to express thoughts, feelings, and ideas as directly as possible. So that would be a direct communication style. And then high context cultures use more indirect cultures. So they value using language to maintain social harmony. So it's very nonverbal kind of communication. They use a lot of nonverbal techniques to communicate rather than more direct verbal communication. I'm sorry if you can hear footsteps or pounding. I swear no one's getting murdered upstairs. It's just we have very thin flooring in between my office and the room upstairs, and so you can hear everything. Okay, so elaborate and succinct. If you have a better pronunciation of the word, please tell me. I always suck at pronouncing this word. So elaborate is more richer. It's a richer and more expressive way of speaking, and it commonly uses exaggerations. For instance, in the Arabic culture, Arabs a lot of times use exaggerations, and because their culture kind of has this belief system that if you don't exaggerate things when you speak, then you don't truly mean them in a way. And then silence is valued, which ironically, Americans and North Americans are actually more common to use this kind of indirectness or this kind of silence, where a lot of Um, uh, how do I explain this? A lot of times in comfortable situations or situations, we kind of believe the less is more sometimes. This is more true, I guess, for Native American than fully North American, but I can see this in our Western culture as well, where sometimes instead of dealing with social situations or like really weird, awkward social situations, instead of actually continue speaking, a lot of times we stay silent and kind of try to blend into the wall as much as possible. Um, I know I am the opposite of that a lot of times. When I'm nervous, I usually cannot stop speaking and I just continue speaking and I tell really bad jokes when I'm nervous. So that's like the opposite of me. But yeah, so that kind of goes into the silent thing. And then formality and informality kind of goes in, um, is the third aspect of how verbal communication styles uh, can be affected by culture and language. And formality, by the way, isn't so much a matter of using correct grammar as of defining social position. So read more into that because different cultures have different systems of um, social position, and that social position is what they mean when it's formal versus informal on how you talk to someone. Okay, last slide. We can finish this in this video. I know we can. Culture and language also is affected, language and worldview. So linguistic relativity is the main concept in this section where it's talking about the worldview of a culture is shaped and reflected by the language its members speak. And then it's talking about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is when uh, these uh, two linguistic specialists, I guess, um, studied the language spoken by the Hopi Native Americans and how that compares to the English language and how the Hopi Native Americans, their language represents a view of reality that is dramatically different from that more familiar tongues. For example, the Hopi language makes no distinction between nouns and verbs. So a lot of times our culture affects the way we speak and the words we use. Like I was saying before, how many cultures outside of the English language and they have different words that have that we don't have in the English that don't translate to English. For instance, Lao, Mandarin, a respectful term used for older people, showing their importance in the family and in society. We don't have a respectful word for older people in our society. We just call them pretty much older people, or we uh, show our respect towards them in our actions, not in the word. While Lao in Mandarin, gosh, I really hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, is a respectful term for older people. And that doesn't really go into the English language. Or Dharma, each person's unique ideal path in life and knowledge of how to find it. We kind of use Dharma in our English language. We actually use just the word Dharma a lot of times for that. A lot of these words I can't really pronounce. Nemowashi is Japanese, the process of informally feeling out all the people involved with an issue before making a decision. We don't really have an English word for that. So a lot of times, just like that example how Eskimos have like 200 or 100, a lot of words for snow, just because they break down different types of snow because they're in that culture where snow is really important to them, so they have multiple words for it. And most languages don't. So your culture and the way you live affects your language and how you use it, which is linguistic relativity. Breaks down what linguistic relativity is. So that is the end of the video and almost the end of this video. So have a good rest of your day and I will see you tomorrow. Have a good one. Bye.